All right, everyone, we are going to go ahead and get started. Good morning. Thank you for joining us today. As you know, our training is hosted by the Center for Housing Solutions, the COC collaborative applicant. And today we have Ariel Bustamante joining us. And Ariel is going to be presenting about LGBTQ preparedness. As you know, this is a two-part training, so we will be together today for 3 hours, and then we will actually reconvene tomorrow morning to continue the session. We hope you will enjoy this two-part training, and I'm going to kick it off to Ariel. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sasha, and good morning, everybody. Thank you for being with us bright and early. Looking forward to spending the next 2 days with you. As Sasha mentioned, my name is Ariel Bustamante. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. If you're not familiar with pronouns, don't worry, you're in the right training to learn all about that. Also, apologies in advance if you hear any weird noises from my 2 dogs in the background. And I'm the capacity building manager at the Los Angeles LGBT Center. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the center in a bit, because you might be wondering, why is the Los Angeles LGBT Center doing this training for folks in Oklahoma? So no worries, hang tight. We're going to answer all your questions today. I'm going to go through some sort of key things for today, and there's going to be lots of audience engagement. One thing I'll let you know is I don't believe in calling on folks cold, so I'm not going to call on anybody without your consent. But the more you participate, the better the training goes for you and for me. So I encourage folks to do so. So today we're going to talk about foundational knowledge for understanding and supporting LGBTQ+ clients, and specifically learning about sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. Again, if any of those words, acronyms are new or new-ish to you, no worries. We're going to cover all of that today and more. So this first unit we're going to go over today is going to talk about sort of the framework we're going to use, permanency. And even though permanency is often a framework used for adolescents, I absolutely think it's a framework that can be applied across life stages, and especially for clients who are experiencing homelessness or housing instability, or any other sort of challenges in their life. So I want to go over some of the roles that I have today and that Sasha is going to be supporting me in. The first thing that I have today is my job is to correct misinformation and biased statements. So I'm not a mean person, but I'm here to do a job, right? I want to make sure you leave with correct information. So you might hear me reframe something or give you best practice language. The next thing is I'm going to answer questions that are relevant to the learning objectives. So we have a finite amount of time this morning and tomorrow morning. So want to make sure that we stay on track, right? And so if we have a question that maybe we're going to answer later on, I'll let you know. If we have a question maybe that's very case specific that you'd like some consultation on, we can parking lot that, and I can provide some support to you offline. And then if we get to something that is just completely removed from today's content, we might pause that question for another time. As I mentioned, again, we have a finite amount of time, so want to make sure we get you out of here on time to go throughout the rest of your day. By the looks of it, many of you are in the office. I'm sure you have services to deliver, so want to make sure you can, get to that on time. That means that when we take our 2 morning breaks, that folks also come back on time so that we can jump right back in. And the last thing is I want to make sure that we have a safe space to be able to have productive conversations. I want to make sure that y'all feel comfortable asking questions, making comments, and really just kind of sussing all of this out. So this is your chance to do all of that. There are really not any bad questions that you can ask because, again, this is a learning space. So the other thing for us today is to talk about hopefully what you all will bring to the table. The first thing is absolutely to respect others' thoughts and feelings, even when they differ from your own, right? We know that folks are going to be coming into this training with lots of different perspectives. And the idea of this training is not to change anybody's personal values or beliefs. It's it is designed to enhance your professional practice, right? So when you come to work and you are serving clients experiencing homelessness, how can we best support them with skills you already have and with some new knowledge and skills you'll gain today and tomorrow? And so for that reason, I ask that folks speak from professional experience. So if you have a question, comment, scenario, we really want to ground it in the lived experiences of our clients and not of, sort of random people, celebrities, right? All these other folks who aren't necessarily close to the work that we're doing and experiencing the things that our clients are experiencing. And then the last one is I ask that folks attempt to manage your any distractions. I know, again, some of you are at work, some of you are at home. Maybe you have kids who are doing Zoom school. Maybe you have that one client who's, blowing up your phone. So if you need to take a step away, I understand, no worries. Please do what you need to do to take care of yourself during today and tomorrow's training. But I do hope that for the majority of you all that you can be sort of on screen today. Certainly when we go into breakout spaces and have a chance for you to talk to your colleagues in the field, that's going to be really helpful just to be able to see one another, read body language, all of that, and just sort of feel more connected. But of course, we don't require anybody, or at least I don't think so. I'll defer to Sasha on that one.
Whatever
So
folks feel comfortable with.
great, perfect. So today, the topics, or rather today and tomorrow, the topics we're going to cover. First thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about language, terminology, concepts, right? I want to make sure folks have a shared set of terms and things that we're going to use today and hopefully in the future. And then we're going to talk about what are the sort of unique barriers that this population experiences as they navigate different systems, right? Be that various homeless services, benefits, the VA, you name it, right? What are the different barriers that they may experience along the way in order to be stabilized? And then the next thing we'll talk about is what is coming out, how is that relevant to this conversation? We'll talk about how to, and this we'll kind of get into tomorrow, we'll talk about how to create and sustain affirming spaces. So what does it look like for your shelters, for your housing programs, for your colleagues in the field to be able to create spaces where all clients can come in and feel welcome, safe, and like they're going to be able to succeed in your programs. And last but not least, we're going to talk about managing information. So what are sort of the guidelines and best practices around disclosures and confidentiality, as well as the legal and professional standards guiding this work. So tomorrow is the time that we'll really get into some of those key things like the equal access rule. We'll refer back to the strategic plan that you all have for your system, and we'll get into some of those more technical pieces. As I mentioned, we'll have 2 short breaks this morning, probably about 5 to 8 minutes, just long enough that you can stretch your legs, maybe refill that cup of coffee, do whatever you need to do quickly to be able to get back to this training. And then you're going to see some learning tools throughout this training. You're going to see some videos. I like to use videos in particular because we don't have any clients in the space today to speak directly to their experience, but it's absolutely important that we center their voices. So those videos are hopefully going to help do some of that. We're also going to have takeaways at the end of each unit. So this is the time where if you fell asleep, you want to wake up, take note. These are really important things. And we'll have best practice guidelines at the end of units. So we know that there's not a whole lot of hard and fast rules when we're doing this type of work, right? There's so much sort of discretion, flexibility, case by case basis. And so this is really to give you, again, sort of a guiding post of when in doubt, what do I lean back on? And then we'll do a couple of these learning assessment activities. So this will be a fun time for you to be able to kind of practice testing your knowledge in a fun environment, and just see where you're at with this information. So as far as other things that you need, the only things I would say for materials is, have some note paper or an open Word document or something to take notes, whatever works best for you, and a writing utensil if you're taking notes yourself. Tomorrow we might do an activity that requires you to have a scrap paper, but other than that, we're good to go. And then you're also going to notice some different icons throughout the day. You'll see them appear in the top right corner. And these are just, again, to help you stay engaged and noted. So take note, these are things that are especially important or might be in one of those fun learning assessments we do. You'll see type in chat when there's a specific invitation to respond to a question. But absolutely, if you have questions, comments, concerns, anything coming up, put that in the chat and we'll respond to that when we can. You'll also see that permanency icon appear throughout the training as a sort of, callback to really what we're working towards. And then also you'll see this info icon when we talk about specific resources that might be valuable to doing the work that you're doing. Before I go any further, does anybody have any questions, anything that folks need to sort of be successful today? And if not, if I can either get a visual thumbs up or if you can use those reaction features, anything to let me know you're good to go. Awesome. I see Samantha, Philip, Kim, Diana, April. Y'all are wonderful. Jacqueline, Michelle. Cool. Okay, we're ready to go. So I want to tell you a little bit about the program that I represent, the center that I represent, again, to hopefully give you some more context as to why we were asked to do this training with you. The Los Angeles LGBT Center is the world's largest LGBT social services organization. So even though we're based in Los Angeles and our primary direct services are in Los Angeles County, we actually provide a variety of services across the country and, in fact, even internationally. Each month, we serve over 50,000 clients in a variety of capacities, be that our drop-in center for youth experiencing homelessness, be that our housing for seniors who need affordable housing, medical services, legal services. We're really sort of a one-stop shop for folks to be able to get the resources we need. And because of that, we often are able to then support other organizations outside of the Los Angeles region to do that work successfully. So one of the things we'll do at the end is connect you with your local LGBT centers and resources there in Tulsa so that you can make sure that you have access to those communities and that your clients have access to those communities. My specific program, RISE, which stands for Recognize, Intervene, Support, and Empower, actually focuses on young people in systems of care. So youth 24 and younger who are in the foster care system and oftentimes who have had exposure to other systems like the juvenile justice or probation system and homeless services. And the idea was when we started, and since we've continued about 10 years ago, was to reduce the number of LGBTQ plus or lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and questioning young people in systems of care. And Gwen, I see your comment there. Yes, we're absolutely going to make sure y'all are connected to different resources. And the other thing that we want to do is increase permanency options, right? So we want to make sure that when young people are exiting care, that they actually are, leaving in a successful way, that they're not going to re-enter systems down the line. So that's really our idea, is that if we upstream, right, when it comes to young people, are able to support them, hopefully down the line, some of you who are serving adults or seniors are not seeing these same young people who have already been exposed to these different systems. And then my team focuses on, so we have a direct service team, and my team focuses on this sort of educational piece. How do we support the workforce to be able to do this work successfully? So you'll hear me kind of refer back to youth a little bit because that, again, is sort of the focus of RISE, but we are absolutely going to talk about different populations, different ages, different needs today, because I know that you all are coming from different backgrounds. As we get to that piece, it would be great if folks can actually introduce themselves in the chat box. So I invite folks to give me your name, and if you also want to give me the organization you're at. I imagine you all have probably been in a lot of trainings with one another over the past several months. It would be great to get a sense of where folks are coming from. And then if there are any particular questions you have, either right now, again, or as we go along, feel free to put those in the chat as well. Thank you. So I see Alice is from a VA homeless program. We have Michelle from Tulsa HUD VASH. We have another VA homeless program. Thank you, Adam. Jack, who works at the Tulsa Day Center. Heather, counseling and recovery. Awesome. Katie at Youth Services of Tulsa. Diana, Volunteers of America. Awesome. Another Volunteers of America. Thank you, Chelsea. Olivia at Housing Solutions. Gwen at VOA Senior Housing. VA, Tulsa from Rebecca. Tulsa Cares, Angela. Nice. Kim, counselor at an outpatient substance abuse treatment program. All right. Allison, thank you for pronouns too, Allison. We have Family and Children's Services Homeless Outreach Team. Great. So it looks like we have a great variety today of, folks coming from different types of services, different programs, again, different needs. So very glad to see all the different things that, all the different modalities and whatnot that folks are coming from. So again, as we go along today, please feel free to jump in that chat again if you have questions, comments, concerns, or if you want to connect, if there's folks that you see in the chat that you haven't had a chance to meet with, that's also a great time to say, hey, we should partner up, or I have a client who might need your services. All right, so let's move forward and talk about sort of the different populations. I'm going to start with youth, and then I'm going to kind of draw back a little bit to the broader population. And then again, as we go along, we'll talk about some of these different groups. Before I do that, I want to talk about this idea of permanency though. So I've said that word a couple of times. And again, if you are somebody who has ever worked particularly with youth, this might be a word that you heard a lot. But unfortunately and surprisingly, it's not a framework that we hear a lot for older folks, right? Once you kind of meet that adult threshold, we aren't necessarily thinking about this work in the framework of permanency. So when we talk about permanency today, we're talking about a holistic sense of that includes things like physical, legal, social, mental, and emotional well-being, safety, stability, all of those things, right? So something that's very expansive. And I say that because today's training, right, is going to be leaning on all of these different principles like housing first and harm reduction, right? And in order to do that, we have to look at the whole person, right? We have to look at the individual needs of every single client and understanding that, yeah, housing absolutely might be an immediate need inherently of clients experiencing homelessness. And if we don't address some of the other things happening in their life, chances are we're going to continue to see this revolving door of clients who aren't being served in the ways that they need. So with that in mind, we want to remember that this includes lifelong connections with supportive adults or other people in their life. It includes a sense of community, right? Connectedness with peers and access that they need to different resources, absolutely to survive, but beyond that to thrive, right? We want our clients to really be able to leave our programs and services at a better place, certainly, than we found them, and hopefully in a place where they are really set up to succeed without as many formal supports like us as possible. So with this population, like I said, I'm going to start with young people, and then I'm going to zoom out to the broader population. When we're talking about young people, so 24 and younger, it's a big chunk of the population, right? We're looking at about 10 or so % of the national population being lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, or questioning. So 1 in 10 young people, all young people, regardless of their housing status. But when we start to look at different systems involvement and knowing that, different systems involvements likely lead to other systems involvement if we're not addressing those needs, we start to see a very different picture. Specifically, when we're talking about young people experiencing homelessness, at least 40% of young people who are experiencing homelessness are LGBTQ+. That's nationally. When we start to look at different jurisdictions, we see that number go up. So for example, Jacksonville, Florida, that number is 60%, right? So we went from 10% of the sort of general population to now 4 to 6 times more than that, depending on your locality. The next thing that we're looking at is involvement in the juvenile justice or probation system. So we see about 20% of the national juvenile justice population being LGBTQ+. In the child welfare system nationally, we see that number at 23%, or just over 1 in 5. In LA County, just to give you reference, we see that about also 1 in 5. And then recent studies suggest 30%. And again, I bring up these different systems because all too often we see young people exiting things like foster care or probation into homelessness. And oftentimes they're aging out of one system and entering the different systems that you all are in, right? And then last but not least, we also see that 85% of all young people report experiencing bullying or harassment in school. And again, you might be thinking, why are we talking about schooling for young people? But certainly for those of you who are working with young people, right, we can talk about McKinney-Vento, of course, and we can talk about that population. But again, we also can see this pipeline, right? There's a story here that we can see of young people who maybe aren't being supported in school, maybe now act out and enter the juvenile justice system, maybe then age out of that system and come to your services, right? So again, that's that holistic sense. The last thing that we're going to look at then is the general population. And again, we'll zoom in along the training to different populations like veterans and seniors. When we're looking at housing programs in general, 1 in 3 clients are LGBTQ+. So that's a high national number. Unfortunately, as you can imagine, there's not always data for all the different jurisdictions that we're working in. But nationally, about 30% of folks who are in different housing programs are LGBTQ+. And we'll talk about why that may be as we go through this training, but that's a pretty high number. So before we go into our first video of the day, any sort of comments, reactions to these numbers, reflections, things that are coming up for you as you think about your own client base? Do these numbers seem high, low? Do they make sense? Are you seeing this at your agency or in your community? And also folks can unmute as well if they prefer to just say out loud. But again, any sort of reactions, thoughts about these numbers? All right, well, hearing nothing. Oh, okay, so Gwen, Tia, a lot of folks saying they seem high. Yeah. And again, we're going to get into this a little bit, but one of the other interesting pieces that we might be thinking about is if these numbers are so high, why aren't we maybe seeing them represented in our programs, at least immediately, right? And that's something we'll dig into. So we're going to watch our first video of the day. This particular video is about George. And George is a young man from Los Angeles. And not all our videos are going to be Los Angeles focused. This just happens to be a good depiction of sort of the narrative we're going for today. And as we watch George's story, I want you to pay attention to his narrative around permanency. What were some of those missed opportunities to support George, and looking at the different ways in which he then had different system involvement, including homeless services. I want to give you all a quick content note for this particular video. As we look at this video, George does experience commercial sexual exploitation, and there's also depictions of law enforcement. So I want to give you that content note. But before we do that, I see Kimberly mentioned here in the comments, I've worked with young adults for over 20 years. Unfortunately, I feel like the numbers have always been high. The kids are just now getting the support, to be honest. Yeah, absolutely, right? This has been a pervasive issue for a very long time. And I think that's one of the reasons we're doing this training, right? Is to say, how do we make sure that we start to address this in a deeper and more meaningful way? So thank you for that reflection, Kimberly. All right, so I'm going to share this video now. It's a couple minutes long, and then we'll have a chance to debrief this video
first time that I found out about Santa Monica Boulevard, I actually came down this street. So that way I knew that I could make money that way. I didn't know what else to do. My biological dad was on drugs, and so he gave me up when I was like 5. And then I stood with my aunt and uncle, and they were super abusive, and I decided my freshman year in high school that I didn't want to live there anymore, so I ran away.
Family rejection for a teenager, it's a very significant trauma. And then to have to leave home because of that is even more traumatic.
Generally, folks say around 40% of homeless youth are LGBT. So knowing that LGBT youth are more likely to be rejected from their family, more likely to be on the streets and homeless, they're going to be more likely to turn to survival crimes.
I didn't have anywhere else to go, so I came out here. It was a tough decision, but it was the only solution I had to my problem. The first time I did it was on this street. Somebody kept cruising by. That was very scary for a 15-year-old. So, and it was a really old man. He took me to his house, which I had no idea where it was at. And it was the first time I did it. I cried the whole time doing that.
The loneliness and the lack of self-esteem that stem from the poor relationships that they may have with their parents just leads to more out-of-home placements for these youth. And because of their being out of their family home, it kind of sets them up for problems later in life.
I got arrested for being a runaway. They put me in the tank for a couple days because I wouldn't tell them my name because I didn't want them to know who I was. So I didn't want them to send me back home. When it was time to see the judge, my aunt had the option to take me back, and she said no. She said I don't want him, which I was very grateful for because there was no way I wanted to be back with her.
LGBT youth are more often detained by the court if a parent doesn't show up to take them home. And so they might have a misdemeanor like shoplifting charge for which youth would not normally be detained. But if their parent doesn't pick them up at the courthouse, then they will be held.
The mere fact that LGBTQ youth do not have a comfortable place to go home to really changes the whole dynamics of their stay in an out-of-home placement. Because it's not just a temporary placement for them. Oftentimes it's just the beginning of their independence or their attempt at independence.
Alrighty, so let's take a minute to reflect on George's story. The first thing I'm curious to hear from folks in the chat or out loud is what was the first disruption that George experienced to his physical permanency? So when we talk about physical permanency, we're talking about, again, sort of housing, stability. And what was that first disruption that he experienced? Yeah, so a lot of folks pointing out dad, right? So dad had some substance abuse issues. Dad was unable to care for George. And then we don't hear about another co-parent, right? We don't hear about there's another parent in the household, but we do hear that the parent that George talks about was experiencing challenges around substance misuse. So George goes to live with a relative, which is always the ideal thing for adolescents. We want to keep them as close to home as possible. So let's give them to somebody, hopefully, who they know, who they're going to be safe with. And that also doesn't work out, right? We see George then now exiting that particular system of care, experiencing homelessness, experiencing commercial sexual exploitation, and experiencing contact with the juvenile justice system, all of which are things that when we look at statistically are things that could impact him later in life as far as entering now the adult systems of care. So what would you all say about the way that his experience with his relatives impacted his life? When you think about sort of his narrative, if this was a client you were talking to, how would you say that experience impacted his life and sort of his trajectory, his outcomes? Yeah, so Kim pointed out he felt rejected and had no self-worth. Absolutely. Negatively, yeah, he felt like he had no other options. He was in survival mode. Absolutely. Thank you, Adam, for that. Yeah, so, and Jacqueline pointing out he probably doesn't trust anybody if he couldn't trust at all. Yeah, so as Philip points out, building trust bonds become harder. So now that George enters any of these systems, he comes to any of our doors, it's going to be really hard to build rapport with George, right? George is probably not going to be incredibly trustful of us. George is probably a client that initially we're going to be working on some of those basic needs, hygiene, clothing, maybe transportation assistance, in order to kind of build up our ability to then engage around what are your long-term needs, George? How do we talk about housing in the long term? How do we make sure that you are engaging in safer practices, right? So all of these are things that absolutely impacted him. And if we had to guess, do we think George finished high school? Or what do we think his educational attainment is? Yeah, no. So definitely, you know, a lot of folks jumping in saying no. And for a young person, again, like George, as you mentioned, Philip, George is in survival mode. So things like school are not necessarily a priority. But again, that's something that we know is going to have an impact, because what type of jobs is George going to be eligible for, right? As he ages out and enters the workforce, is he going to be able to attain employment that allows him to have a livable wage and not fall into homelessness after he exits foster care or probation? And I'm going to, well, we can talk about this one, but do you think George is going to find sort of legal permanency? Do you think at this rate, George is at this point, right, in his late teens, he's experienced all this trauma. Do we think George is likely to find legal permanency, meaning adoption, guardianship, somebody who's really going to take charge of George's life in order to support his well-being long-term? Yeah, Tia mentioned so many employers won't hire with legal issues, right? So depending on how old George was when he got picked up, depending on how they decided to charge him, it's very possible that he has something on his adult record, not something on his youth record that could maybe be expunged. So something that could absolutely impact his long-term employment prospects, even if we can stabilize George. Gwen pointing out so many families want a baby, not a young person, right? So once we get to youth who are older, like George, who maybe are quote unquote complicated, right? It gets a lot harder to say, take a chance on this person and give them a home, give them love. And again, hopefully they don't come, out of that system and into our systems. So as we think about that, right, again, we can think about the different young people, but as well as adults and seniors we might be encountering. When we think about outreach, right, so I know a couple of you said you're doing outreach. In the community, right, we might be running into folks like George across the age spectrum. About 30% of outreach clients are also LGBTQ+, at least nationally. So again, we're going to be running into this population repeatedly across the age spectrum, across the needs spectrum. So I'm going to pause here. We've been going for about 45 minutes, and I want to take our first break of the morning. It's 7:41, so let's just take a quick 5-minute break. We'll come back at 7:46, and we'll jump into sort of our meatiest unit of today to talk about, and I'm sorry, I said 7:46. It's 9:46. I know y'all are 2 hours ahead of me, but you know what I meant. 9:46, we'll come back and jump back in. Alrighty, welcome back, folks. And we are going to jump now into our second unit of the day. And this is going to be, as I mentioned, sort of our meatiest unit of this entire training, because we want to make sure that you get all the information that you need, but we also want to make sure that you have a strong foundation. So when we're talking about the LGBTQ plus population, the most recent sort of statewide study for Oklahoma says that close to only 4% of folks in Oklahoma self-identify as LGBTQ plus. Now, again, that may make it a challenge, right, to say, well, then why are we going to zero in on this population? But as I mentioned earlier, right, if we're looking at 4% of the population, right, but we're looking at anywhere from 30-ish to maybe more percent in our systems, that absolutely means that there is a need to address this in a way that sort of reduces those disparities. So with that in mind, we're going to take a look at what does this terminology mean, right? I keep using these acronyms and language. Let's make sure that we have a shared understanding of what these words mean, so that hopefully when we're working with clients, we have a little bit more knowledge about the community. So my first question for you all in the chat is, how have you heard clients using the word gay? When you hear a client, not you, not your coworkers, but how do you hear clients using the word gay? So Kira says an umbrella term. Okay. What else? How else are we hearing that? Jack says, that's so gay, sometimes as an insult. Yeah, so that band is so gay, that person is so gay, right? But not necessarily gay as an LGBT. Kimberly says, they've used it to negatively describe something happening in life. So that housing program is so gay, or you know, my roommate, right? Whatever those things. Ashley saying in a derogatory way. April also says, I've heard it as I am a gay man, so self-identification. Yeah, so I'm hearing a lot of different things here. Gwen says, many seniors still will not say that they are gay or identify at all. Interesting, right? So we have some clients who are using it negatively. We have other clients who are self-identifying. And then maybe we have some clients who aren't even using that word at all because it's still a taboo word. Absolutely. So we know that gay isn't inherently a bad word, right? But again, context matters, and we see that coming up in a lot of different ways. We know that especially among younger populations, gay is used as an insult. We know that historically this term has meant happy. So if any of you grew up watching the Flintstones like me, when they said they were going to have a gay old time, they weren't saying they were going to have an LGBT time. They were saying they were going to have a happy time, right? And then by definition, this word describes somebody who's attracted to somebody of the same gender as themselves. So for example, a man who's attracted to another man, or a woman who's attracted to another woman. But we have to look for a lot of different contextual cues, right, to be able to understand, for example, when a client uses this, are they self-identifying? Are they using it in a derogatory way? Are they afraid to say it, right? What is the energy behind that? So we'll hold on to that thread as we go along today, because again, that is something that is really going to matter with all of these words, is context and clues and connotation. So one of the things that I want to start us out with is our genderbread person. And you're going to get handouts after today's training that give you a bunch of these materials. The other thing I forgot to mention at the very beginning is these slides will be made available afterwards. So if any of you are furiously taking notes, trying to capture all of this training is being recorded. We're going to give you the slides, and I'm going to send you home with lots of resources afterwards to be able to utilize. So we're going to start off with our very adorable genderbread person here. And the first thing that we're going to start off with is sex assigned at birth. So all of us in today's training, all of our clients were born at some point or another. Some of us a little longer, some of us shorter, right? But we were all born at some point in time. And when we were born, one of the first things that came out of the doctor, the doula, the midwife, somebody's mouth was, it's a boy or it's a girl, right? And they were making that determination based on external genitalia. They looked between that baby's legs and they said, this baby has a penis. This baby is M for male. We're going to put that on the birth certificate. Or this baby has a vagina, so we're going to put F for female. And that is all sex assigned at birth is at its core, right? That basic determination at birth, typically by a medical professional. What sex are we assigning this baby? What are we putting on a birth certificate? And that will likely indicate things that we may put on things like other legal documents down the line. Does that make sense for folks? That's pretty clear, right? Again, we were all born, we get it. The next thing though, as we moved along, is our gender identity. And our gender identity is our inner sense of self. When we think about ourselves, do we know ourselves to be a man? Do we know ourselves to be a woman? Or do we know ourselves to be something else? And we'll talk about that something else in a little bit. Gender identity develops around 2.5 to 6 years old. So if any of you have ever worked with toddlers or have toddlers in your life, you've probably seen a lot of different things happening in that stage of life around identity development, right? They're figuring out a lot of things in their world. They're touching a lot of things. They're probably always sticky and whatnot, but they're also starting to figure out who they are in the world. And while they may not have all the language, you might start to hear little ones say things like, I'm a boy and boys do this, or I'm a girl and girls don't do that. And that's part of gender identity development, is little ones starting to understand and relate to things they see in the world. Now, again, this isn't finite. These are sort of general child adolescent development milestones and part of natural childhood development. But that doesn't mean that down the line, somebody might not, have a better understanding of who they are, gain access to information, and start to put together pieces to say, maybe I didn't have the language when I was 7, 10, 15 years old, but now that I'm 60 years old and I feel safer, I can share a piece of myself that I didn't feel like I could, decades ago. And then the next thing we're looking at is gender expression. So how do we communicate externally to the world who we are? Do we have a more feminine presentation? Do we have a more masculine presentation? All right, do we have a more androgynous presentation? And this can be lots of different things. This can be clothing, hairstyle, makeup, no makeup, right? This can be the tone of our voice. Do we have a higher voice or a lower voice? This could even be other mannerisms, right? Different ways that we show up in the world. And oftentimes even career choices, right? We know that a lot of different career fields, including social services, are highly dominated by more feminine folks. Not to say again that there's not a lot of diversity. The last thing that we look at here is sexual orientation. And the easiest way to help you all think about sexual orientation is to have you do a quick little exercise with me. So I'm going to invite you, if you feel comfortable, to divert your gaze or close your eyes. And I want you to think back to the first crush that you can remember. I want you to think about who this person was, where you got to meet them. Maybe it was on the playground. Maybe it was once a week on TV. And how did you know that you liked this person? What sort of feelings did you have? And when you're ready, you can open your eyes. And this activity, without fail, every single time, I always get a couple of little grins and things like that because folks, it's fun to think back to that first crush that we can remember. And getting, as you mentioned, Jack, those butterflies in the stomach, all of those giddy feelings. Maybe you were like me and you got super awkward and sweaty palms, or maybe you got really confident and cool. And if you did, kudos to you. So I'm curious to hear maybe from a couple of folks in the chat or out loud, a little bit about your first crush, maybe how old you were, how you felt when you got to see this person. I love doing this as well because sometimes folks are like, I remember their first, middle, and last name, the street they lived on, and we were going to get married. So any sort of details folks want to share in the chat, I'd love to hear from a couple of folks. So April says, first grade, he was my quote unquote boyfriend. Yeah, so first grade, that's around 6, 7 years old. Yeah. And let's see, who's off mute? Kim, yeah, do you want to share?
Yes, I remember in 3rd grade, a new boy came to our class and he was from Hawaii. And that seemed so far away and so exotic living in Oklahoma. And he looked different than we did. So all the girls had a crush on Tony.
Tony, okay. And how did you feel when you got to see Tony? What went through your mind?
I was breathless and wide-eyed. I remember just thinking he was so different and so neat.
Yeah, thank you, Kim. Thank you for being brave and vulnerable with the group. So Tony, all right. And then we have Gwen over here, 6 years old, Davy Jones on the Monkeys. Nice, Gwen. We also have Diana, age 5, kindergarten class, tummy tingles, nervous. He was so kind and awkward. Oh, that's so sweet. And Kimberly saying Fonzie on Happy Days. I remember laughing all the time at him. So funny, yeah, making you laugh. My parents always asked, what's so funny? But I didn't know. Yeah, right. That's the thing about attraction is sometimes we really can't describe it, put a word on it, but we know we're attracted to somebody. So sexual orientation is a pattern of attraction. And the idea of this activity isn't to say, well, the first crush you had defines who you are for the rest of your life. What we're really kind of pinpointing there are those different feelings that came up for you, right? And those are positive feelings of attraction. So if we think back to George's story, for example, George described when he was with his trafficker, feelings of fear, discomfort, right? Those are negative feelings. That is not attraction. That is a reaction to survival. On the other hand, I hear you all sharing these really fun feelings, these feelings of excitement, right? These feelings of joy. And the other thing that I noticed is nobody said, I knew that I liked Tony or whoever my crush was because we held hands, because we kissed behind the bleachers, right? I mean, chances are, and apologies, Kimberly, but chances are, and even now, probably didn't get to meet Fonzie, right? Probably still not going to happen. So we have crushes throughout our lives, people who we're attracted to, who we're lucky if we ever get to talk to them, much less do anything else, but we know that we are attracted to them. So that helped us kind of pull apart this idea that sexual behavior and identity are not always going to be aligned, right? We can have a lot of different attractions to people throughout our lives, and that doesn't necessarily translate into specific behaviors. So we want to remember that as we're working with clients, assessing for their needs, listening to their narrative, that we're not automatically applying labels to them without their consent. So moving on, as we think about these things, right, I want to complicate it. So that was sort of the basic framework, SOGIE, as I mentioned, sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. And all of us have a SOGIE, not just LGBTQ plus people. But we know that there's a lot more variation to the world. And for example, on this color wheel, right, many of us, our eyes can typically see these different colors. But we know that there's some gradients to that, sometimes lighter, darker versions. And even then, we know that there's also more variation to that, right? Things continually get blurry because that's part of the human experience, right? Is that diversity in experience, diversity in voice, diversity in identity. And the same is true when we think about SOGIE. So when we think about SOGIE, we want to think about it on spectrums. The first piece here around sex assigned at birth, again, referring to different physiological traits, are female, right, on one end of the spectrum, so somebody who's assigned female at birth. On the other end, we have this term male. And then in the middle, we have this word intersex. Has anybody heard of this word intersex before? Is this a new word for anyone, or is this a word that folks are familiar with? See a couple of nods, thumbs up, a couple of folks saying new, thank you in the chat. So the old, outdated, and stigmatized word for intersex is hermaphrodite. So that's one of those words as we're going through today and we want to be culturally responsive. We want to start to fill in intersex where we might say hermaphrodite. And stereotypically, and we'll watch a video, but stereotypically, when we think about intersex people, we might think of somebody who has ambiguous genitalia. That's sort of how it's depicted in life, or at least commonly. But there's actually 43 different ways that somebody can be intersex that the medical community knows of as of right now. So being intersex has to do with some variation around your internal reproductive organs, your external genitalia, your hormones, and or your chromosomes. So it's not always going to show up in the ways that we stereotypically expect. But about 1 in 2,000 live births result in intersex babies. So that's actually pretty common when you think about it. It's more common, or as common rather, than anybody who has naturally red hair or green eyes. So it's pretty common, but we just don't talk about it. Now, as I mentioned, we'll watch a video in a little bit that's going to talk a little bit more about that. But if you have questions as we go along, feel free to throw those in the chat. The next thing that we're looking at is gender identity. Again, our inner sense of self. Do we know ourselves to be a woman or a girl? Do we know ourselves to be a man or a boy? Or maybe we know ourselves to be non-binary. And I loved earlier that somebody uses this framing of an umbrella term. Because non-binary, well, it refers to somebody who doesn't sort of neatly identify along the gender binary of being strictly a woman or strictly a man, can also be an umbrella term for a variety of other terms. We're going to get into that. But the other things that I want you to understand are the relationship between sex assigned at birth and gender identity. Because we know that these things are not always going to align in the ways that we stereotypically expect. So we might have somebody like myself. I was assigned female at birth. My gender identity is woman. That means that I am a cisgender woman, CIS gender, cis meaning same in Latin. And that means that my sex assigned at birth and my gender identity align in the ways that we stereotypically or traditionally expect. We might have somebody who was assigned male at birth and whose gender identity is man or boy, and that would make them a cisgender man. So that describes the relationship, right? Cisgender describes the relationship. It's an adjective that describes the sex assigned at birth and gender identity relationship. This might be a new word for a lot of folks, but the term that I imagine more of you are familiar with is transgender. And when we talk about somebody who's transgender, we're talking about somebody, again, trans, that root kind of referring to across, somebody whose gender identity and sex assigned at birth do not align in the ways we might traditionally expect. So for example, we might have somebody who was assigned male at birth and whose gender identity is woman. So this would be a transgender woman. We might have somebody who was assigned male at birth and is non-binary, and we would describe this person, if this is the language they used, as a transgender non-binary person. So there's a lot of variation there. Other terms that you might be hearing, and you're going to get a whole glossary of terms, so don't worry if you're struggling to remember all of this. These are just a few of the words that you might hear. So two-spirit is a term that is commonly used in Indigenous, First Nation, and Native American communities. And two-spirit is one of those umbrella terms that describes folks who don't fit neatly within the gender binary. Another word you might hear is genderqueer. And I've used that word queer a lot today, but I imagine some of you are sitting back and saying, wait a minute, are we okay to use this word? Are we not okay to use this word? What's going on? I've heard different things. And the answer, much like what everything else we're talking about today, is it just depends. Queer is one of these words that we describe as an in-group word versus an out-group word. So what that means is if I'm part of a community that uses that word, and maybe you're my case manager and I use that word to describe myself, that is sort of an invitation to reflect that language back to me. But if I don't know you, if I haven't used that word to describe myself, it's not best practice to use that word to describe me. And culturally, many of us have words like that, right? Words that when we're with our friends, our family, or other sort of social group, we might use words that are totally okay. But if somebody comes into our space who we don't know, who we don't have a relationship with, and uses that word, suddenly all bets are off, right? So queer is very much like that. It is something that historically has absolutely been a painful word for a lot of folks, especially our seniors. That is a word that historically was used in a very derogatory sense as a put down, and is not always a word that older folks may identify with. Increasingly, though, we're seeing folks reclaim that word and say, you know what, queer just means different. It means other. And I'm okay to use that word. I'm taking that word back. So again, there's going to be different other cultural elements to take into account as well. You might have somebody who is agender, so somebody who doesn't sort of align across at any point along the gender identity spectrum. So these are just a few examples of additional terms you may hear, but again, you're going to get a glossary. Then we move along to gender expression. So how we express and communicate gender. And are we, again, more feminine? Are we more masculine? Are we androgynous, meaning that we either have traits that are both masculine and feminine, or that are sort of gender neutral? And I love talking about gender expression in particular, because it's something that I think as we start to parse out these different pieces of SOGIE, we start to really realize that there is so much variation even in our own lives. Chances are, if you're somebody who would describe yourself as feminine, you don't fit neatly into a box of what stereotypical feminine people look like and sound like and behave 100% of the time. Maybe you do, but for most of us, right, we're going to see some variation there. Same thing if you're somebody who would say you're a masculine person, right? Chances are 100% of the time, you don't fit neatly within those expectations of what quote unquote masculinity looks like. So food for thought there. The last thing that we'll look at here, again, is sexual orientation, which develops again between 6 to 12 years old. And we might have somebody who's heterosexual or straight, meaning they're attracted to somebody of a different gender than themselves. We might have somebody who's gay or lesbian, meaning they're attracted to somebody of the same gender. Lesbian is used to describe a woman attracted to another woman. Gay can be used to describe anybody attracted to somebody of the same gender. And then we have bisexual here in the middle, meaning somebody who's attracted to 2 or more genders, not necessarily their own. I'll say that one more time because that might be a new definition for folks. 2 or more genders, not necessarily their own. And that's because, again, we look at this second spectrum here, gender identity, and we see that there's already 3 genders that we see represented there. So let's put this into practice because I imagine for a lot of you, you're like, this is a lot of information. How am I possibly going to retain all of this? The good news is you don't need to memorize all of this. What you do need to understand is the basic concepts and then be able to engage in dialogue with clients, with coworkers around these topics. So let's say we have a client who was assigned female at birth. They were born, doctor looked at them, they said, this baby is a female. We're going to stamp F for female on that birth certificate. And I always say stamp as if we still do stamping on a birth certificate, but I think it's digitized at this point. Mine is stamped on there. And then we have, as this young person grows up, let's say maybe around 8 years old, as they've been growing up, saying things like, you know, everyone says I'm a girl, but I'm not a girl, I'm a boy. So this child we would describe as a transgender boy. And as this boy grows up, their gender expression is generally pretty masculine. And then they reach that delightful time in anybody's adolescence where they start to experience attraction, having crushes, right? Getting super awkward. And they are attracted to girls. Why would we describe this hypothetical client as heterosexual or straight and not gay or lesbian, based on what I just told you?
I would say it's because the individual inner sense of gender is masculine. So she feels that she was born a boy, even though she was assigned female and was born with those parts. Her inner self says she's a boy. So therefore, her being attracted to a female makes him feel that he's straight. He was actually straight, he was actually a male versus a female. So therefore, he would identify as being a straight man, not a female, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you so much, Keisha. I appreciate, and I loved also being able to follow your thought process there and your sort of self-correction, because yeah, so again, assigned female at birth, they are a man or a young man, a boy. And again, this is a hypothetical person. We don't know what pronouns they use, but we would use, without necessarily knowing, I would use either the client's name or he, him pronouns. And again, as people are saying in the comments, this young man is attracted to girls. So if we didn't know anything else about this person, we saw this young man walking down the street holding hands with his girlfriend, you know, celebrating Valentine's Day or whatever. If we had to put a label on it, chances are we would describe him as straight or heterosexual, right? And then this is again a hypothetical. Of course, we're always going to defer back to the client and reflect the language that they utilize. So this was just a hypothetical to get us some practice in thinking about that. So we are going to watch another video now. And this particular video is to help you better understand what it means to be intersex. So we are going to watch this video and then we'll have a chance to debrief. But hopefully this will help you better understand what it means to be intersex.
Raise your hands if you have testes. I'm Pigeon.
I'm Alice.
I'm Emily.
I'm Cypher.
And we are Intersexy.
Intersex describes a person who doesn't fit the typical definition of male or female.
I have XY chromosomes, but typical female genitalia.
I'm a girl who has testes and XY chromosomes.
I identify as a queer, gender nonconforming intersex person.
I identify as a Black intersex man.
Intersex is not new. It's been around since the beginning of human existence. I mean, there's probably even intersex dinosaurs, if you think about it.
Transgender has to deal with your gender identity, whereas intersex has to deal with your biological characteristics.
Often, intersex people get surgeries that they don't want, and transgender people have to fight for surgeries that they do want. They gave my mom the excuse that the internal testes were cancerous, that I would develop cancer.
They didn't even come up with an excuse, basically, in terms of a health-related reason. They instead just said it was about the appearance.
A lot of doctors are very uncomfortable with the idea that I have testes, and they're still trying to get them removed, but I'm perfectly healthy and there's nothing wrong with them.
They did a surgery to remove my testes and told my parents to take me home and just raise me as a girl, and I didn't find out about it myself until I was 12.
There aren't a lot of options, or medical providers don't explore other options. My mom would put me in dresses and she would be like, "Oh, aren't you so cute and you're so pretty?" And I would be like, "No, this is horrible." I was put on hormonal treatment, which consisted of estrogen and progesterone. I just wanted to belong. I wanted to fit in. I didn't want to be different. So even though I knew something felt amiss, I conformed. He was very condescending. He was like, "You intersex activists don't know what you're talking about."
It's difficult for intersex people to find each other because from an early age we're told not to talk about our bodies.
I did feel like I was the only one.
My doctors always told me there was nobody else like me, and so it just perpetuates a vicious cycle of shame and stigma that we can't break out of. I would tell another intersex person that you are worthy, you are lovable.
Your body is beautiful, you're beautiful.
Intersex people don't need to be fixed. There's nothing wrong with them.
I know you feel like you might not be able to get through this. I know you might have really dark thoughts, but I want you to know that meeting other intersex people and finding a community or a support group can be one of the most important aspects in your healing process. And we're out there, we're out here, we're here. And I just hope you can find us.
Alrighty, so hopefully that video was helpful in getting a better sense of intersex identities. And let's talk a little bit about that. So my first question to you all is, why do you think doctors and parents may decide to perform normalizing surgeries on intersex children? What might be the different motivations that a doctor or a caregiver has?
I think that some people think that they're doing the best thing for that person. I don't want you to live with this for the rest of your life, so I'm going to take care of you now and you'll be fine.
Yeah, thank you so much, Gwen. So one of the core motivations of a parent or caregiver is protection, right? This instinct to protect. But the motivation behind that is also fear, right? I'm afraid of what my child may experience in life down the line as an adult. What is that going to mean for relationships? All these different things that we start to think about. And we operate from a place of, how can I protect my child? How can I stop bullying, harassment, any sort of harm they may experience down the lines, shame or stigma, right? So absolutely. I notice in the chat box we see here as well, Allison said they might be uneducated. Yeah, so doctors and parents, right, may not have the information, but especially parents. If a doctor is telling you there's something wrong with your baby, but we can fix it, chances are you're going to say, yeah, do it, go for it, right? We'll take care of my baby. Katie also said social norms, right? So we're conditioned to say there's only two boxes, male or female. That's it. There's no variation. You either are one or the other. And physiologically, that's just not accurate. Chelsea sort of echoing the same thought. They haven't had intersex individuals normalized for them. Yeah. So interestingly enough, Emily, the young woman in the red top, she, the one who talked about sort of doctors continually, even into adulthood, offering to perform surgeries. The reason that she didn't have any of these normalizing procedures conducted was because she actually had another family member who was also intersex. And because of that, her family had gained knowledge around what that meant. And, you know, once Emily was born, they had a little bit more information. Yeah, Kim also, or Kimberly saying some parents think it would be best. April echoing that, to fit the idea of normal. Heather, fear of having a child who's different. Angela also saying the same message, multiracial kids here, right? So there's a lot of pressure, again, to fit into a box, right? Chelsea echoing lack of understanding. Diana, shame, stigmatism, protection, making the choice for the individual in hopes it will make a better life. Jacqueline also saying, I think they feel the patient may not understand or might be frightened by how they were born and not know how to discuss with the parent. So say what they think would be medically fixable, right? Yeah, so all of these, right, are definitely reasons why a doctor or a parent may be motivated to do this. And really quickly, I noticed that we had a question before we got into that video. So let me go back to that to see. Tia, yeah, so Tia asked, I've always wanted to know the appropriate way to ask. And I'm going to get back to that question because that was around sort of how folks identify. So don't worry, Tia, I'm going to get back to that. So my next question for you all is, what is the difference between being transgender and being intersex? They talked about it a bit in this video, But based on what we know now, what is the difference?
Is transgender is the folks who actually want to have a surgery to change their body to how they identify, and the ones who were born that way are were born how they were born. I don't know exactly how to word that.
I follow your thought, Gwen, and thank you for that, for volunteering. So you're on the right track, as are folks in the chat box, right? So when we're talking about somebody who's intersex, we're referring to physiological traits related to their sex assigned at birth. When we're talking about somebody who's transgender, as folks have mentioned, we're talking about gender identity. We're talking about the relationship of gender identity and sex assigned at birth. And we'll get a little bit more into this, but not all transgender people want or can undergo any type of medical procedures, right? So not everybody who's transgender wants to, for example, take hormones or have any type of surgery to have their body maybe be more reflective of the way we expect that gender identity to show up. Again, some people don't want that. A lot of folks, especially the clients that we serve, absolutely don't have access to that, right? Because medical care is already a costly expense for anybody, certainly somebody experiencing homelessness, much less any type of specialized medical care. And certainly in a region where maybe there's not as much expertise, right? Finding a doctor who is appropriate and able to serve them in a way that is, responsive and affirming of their identity. So again, transgender has to do with gender identity, intersex has to do with sex assigned at birth. And then last question for you all. Saifa was the young man with the glasses. He talked about a lot of different things. So he talked about being a Black intersex man. He talked about mom making him wear dresses for a long, long time. When we ask about Saifa's sexual orientation, what word would we apply there? Chelsea, right out the gate, got it correct. That was a trick question. Chelsea said, I don't recall him naming an orientation, and that's correct. So Saifa, again, he said, I'm a Black intersex man. He talked about growing up, his mom sort of treating him and socializing him as a young woman, but he didn't tell us who he's attracted to. And again, that's important because as we're listening to clients, any client, right, we don't want to try to fill in the blanks or say, oh, okay, well, based on what Saifa's telling me, I think this is who Saifa's attracted to, right? And going back to Tia's question about, well, how do we engage in this conversation? How do we ask about this? Two parts to this. The first part is it relevant for any of these questions? Generally, we look at these things as on a need to know basis. So is that something that's going to be relevant to that person's care? We don't want to ignore it, right? We don't want to say, oh, okay, we don't have to worry about sexual orientation that has nothing to do with their housing status. But we also don't want to say that that's not a conversation we can have. So depending on the setting, right, that might be a place, maybe we're doing intake and on our forums, that's a question we want to ask, right? And we want to be asking those questions of every single client. We could also be engaging in conversations around, again, needs. So maybe the client shares with us that they haven't been successful in other programs. And that might be a place where we can dig in to better understand, well, what's been going on there? So when we get to the next unit, we'll dig a little bit more into that. And then a couple of resources that you might find helpful, whether it's for your own professional development or for clients. The first one is Interact, and the website for Interact is interactadvocates.org. And this is a national organization that works with intersex people and families to do education and provide resources and referrals. And then the other organization we like to refer folks to is the Intersex Justice Project. So they're also a national organization that does work around intersex identities, connecting people to resources, and also making sure that These normalizing procedures don't happen when they're not, absolutely medically necessary. So to kind of recap here, when we think about gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation, we want to remember that none of these things are determined by body parts. The only thing determined by body parts are sex assigned at birth. The next thing is that these things are distinct from one another. So if it's helpful to visualize those different spectrums, we can remember they never touched one another, right? They were independent of one another. So with that in mind, we also want to avoid assumptions, right? We want to be able to kind of go into this with an open mind. And we also then want to avoid assumptions about care. One of the stories I frequently share is working with a social worker several years back who had a lesbian client who was pregnant. And this particular social worker could not wrap their mind around the idea that the client was pregnant, but the client was also a lesbian. That was absolutely a learning moment to make sure that that client had appropriate housing, appropriate medical care, right? And also to really just talk about, well, how can these two things coexist, right? And how do we make sure that the client's needs are being met? And then the last piece, as a reminder, sexual orientation and sexual behavior are different. Those are two different things. So just because a client discloses particular behaviors with us doesn't mean that we can say, based on what you're telling me, you must be gay, or you must be lesbian, or you must be straight or bisexual, or whatever the terminology may be. So that sort of brings us to other ways that we can be mindful with our language and use this as a tool to build rapport instead of damage rapport. Of course, again, as we get into this, right, we know that being able to communicate with our clients is the first and foremost thing in order to be able to get them the support that they need. If they don't feel safe in talking to us, we can't oftentimes provide them with a whole lot. And so we want to be mindful of things. For example, some of the phrases that can damage rapport are phrases like lifestyle or phase. So referring to somebody as, oh, they're living the gay lifestyle, or, my client's not really bisexual, they're just kind of going through a phase where they're experimenting. Those are phrases and words that could absolutely damage your ability to have a productive conversation with a client. The same thing here when we talk about preference or choice. When we talk about somebody's identity, right? It's not a preference or a choice, it's just who they are. Popular is another word that we may use. So I hear this in particular in an adolescent sense, less so with adults. Oh, my client is just identifying that way because it's popular or it's cool or it's trendy right now. And while we can absolutely say that increasingly LGBTQ plus people are more visible in the world, right? Definitely in the past 10 to 20 years, there's been a huge sort of resurgence of folks being able to openly identify. We also know that, again, statistically, it is not cool or trendy to be LGBTQ plus. It oftentimes comes with a lot of negative experiences that folks may experience, as well as resilience. And then homosexual is just sort of an outdated term. So it's not a bad word, but it's just one of those words that unless the client uses that word and we want to reflect that back, we can say gay, we can say LGBT, right? But homosexual, again, tends to be an outdated word increasingly. And then he, she, or it. This is one of those hard and fast rules. We never want to dehumanize somebody by calling them a he, she, or an it. If we don't know how to refer to somebody, we can ask them what name they go by or the pronouns they use, but we don't want to dehumanize somebody by calling them a he, she, or it. The other thing that we can do then is we can also be asking ourselves, where can we use more gender neutral and inclusive language? So are there opportunities to be able to talk to our clients in a way that doesn't necessarily assume elements about their identity or the identities of people in their life? So maybe our client comes to us and says, I'm married, I need to access a housing program that's going to be able to accommodate me and, my partner or my spouse. Let's say this I'm the client, right? naturally you might say, okay, well, tell me a little bit about your husband. I need to kind of gather his information. Is he able to come in so we can do an intake with him, right? That's an opportunity to be a little bit more inclusive. So instead of saying, well, tell me about your husband and we need to do an intake with him and we need to be able to identify housing for both of you, we might instead say, okay, is your spouse here with you today? Or is your partner here with you today? Do they have any particular needs we need to know about, right? Can you provide me with some type of legal documentation, because some of the shelter programs I know are going to ask for that, right? So those are just ways that we can open up our language and terminology. So we can also, do basic things like in greetings. Hello all, welcome everybody. If we're holding maybe a group session. Again, as I mentioned, in questions. And then we can also ask for and use pronouns. I introduced myself with my pronouns this morning. I noticed a couple of you put your pronouns in your name on Zoom, and that's awesome. And pronouns are the ways that we describe somebody or talk about somebody in the English language without using their name. So common pronouns that we may see are she, her, and hers. In Spanish, you might see ella, E-L-L-A. You might see he, him, and his, or él, again in Spanish. You might also hear they, them, and theirs, or in Spanish, ellas or ella with an X or an E. So that looks like she's running late. We're going to wait for her before we get started. That backpack belongs to her. He's a nice person. I really enjoy working with him. I'm not sure if that backpack is his or not. And even though they, them, and theirs might be newer to you, chances are you're already using it throughout your day. Maybe you get a phone call and somebody leaves a message and you say, hey, Heather, can you give them a call back? You just used they, them, and theirs in a gender neutral way, right? And you probably weren't thinking about it. Or we're in a training in person. Oh, somebody left behind their phone. I don't know who it belongs to. Right? Again, so we're using that throughout the day probably without even realizing it. Some people may also say you can use any pronoun for me. Any pronoun is fine. Can't go wrong. Other people may say, please don't use any pronouns. Please just use my name. So if we're talking about that client or writing case notes about that client, we might just say, Ariel came in for her employment appointment today. Ariel is applying to multiple jobs in the community at grocery stores and food establishments. Ariel was provided a bus pass to be able to go to those job interviews. So that's how we would do that. When we don't use the name or pronouns that somebody uses, that's what's called misgendering. And misgendering can happen intentionally. It can happen or unintentionally, right? It can happen either way. But when we do this, this absolutely is something that can, harm our ability to be able to provide them with the best care possible. And Tia asked a quick question before we go any further. Yeah, so there might be other pronouns that folks use. This is definitely not an exhaustive list. One of the handouts I'm going to provide you with is sort of a pronoun 101 sheet that will hopefully, be a good reminder, and then also something that you can share with coworkers, keep handy, all of that. The best thing though to do at any point, rather than saying, oh, okay, I got to find my glossary or I got to find that handout that somebody gave me when a client is with us, is, we can listen with openness. And if we're unsure about what a word means, or if we're unsure about how to use those pronouns, we can just say, thanks so much for sharing that with me. Can you tell me a little bit more about that so that I can better support you, right? That's just an easier way instead of trying to memorize an exhaustive list of terms and best practices. So if you do find yourself misgendering somebody, I want you to do a few things. The first thing is apologize. Take accountability. If you mess up somebody's name, what do? You say, oh, I'm so sorry. I realized that it's Angie, not Angela, right? And that's it. We don't make a big deal about it. We don't say, oh my gosh, Angela or Angie, I know so many Angies. let me tell you, I love Angie's. They're the best people in the world. I hope you don't hate me. I'm a really good person, right? We don't do any of that. So the same thing, when we misgender somebody, we can apologize, we can correct ourselves and move on, and then maybe find some other times independently to practice for accuracy. So we can say, I'm sorry, I meant he, not she, and go on. And then maybe later on, as we're reviewing their case, we can kind of practice using those pronouns to make sure that we are going to do better next time. So what we're going to do in just a second is I'm going to put you all into breakout rooms. And in those breakout rooms, you're going to have a chance to practice introducing yourself. So you're going to be paired up with 2 to 3 other people. And when you're in those breakout rooms, I want you to first say your name, your pronouns, and one value that you bring to this work. So for example, my name is Ariel. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and Aya. And one value that I bring to this work is empathy. That's a really important value to me. So I'm going to put you in those groups in just a sec. You'll have about 3 to 4 minutes, just a very quick amount of time. And then we'll come back as a group to review, talk a little bit about how that experience was for all of you. Alrighty, so welcome back, everybody. And I know for some of you that may have been your first time or one of your few times in a breakout room. So if that was fun, cool, thank you, Gwen. So I was about to ask you how it went. How was that? Was it new? Was it different? Was it confusing? How did that experience go, introducing yourself to your colleagues? Allison said it was new for you. Okay, thanks for trying on that activity. Adam, I got to know 2 new people. Excellent. Kim, I enjoyed it. Chelsea, it was lovely to meet Stacy. Excellent. Anybody have any difficulties, challenges, awkwardness, anything, any questions that came up? Jacqueline also says it went well. I met some amazing people doing great things here in Tulsa. We love it. April says, talking about myself is always weird, but it was good. So thank you for that, April. Yeah, sounds like y'all were able to take on this activity and do well. So excellent job. And, you know, I want to sort of emphasize that this is something that we can be doing regularly, is introducing ourselves this way, asking clients for pronouns, right, is something that we can absolutely be doing on the regular. So the other thing that I want to ask folks then about is, or actually encourage you all to do, if you are wanting to, is as a bonus, you can add your pronouns to your screen name. So I know, again, some of you have done that. If you want, you don't have to. If we were in person, I would invite you to add it to your name tent. But if you scroll over your name or your little icon in Zoom, you'll see 3 little dots. You can click that and hit rename, and you'll actually be able to add your pronouns. So this is actually a nice tool as well, because I know many of us are meeting with clients via Zoom or other video software these days. That's a great way, again, to sort of indicate, hey, I'm open, you can talk to me, this is something that I'm knowledgeable about. So that's just one thing you can do. Again, nobody has to do that, but it's a great way, again, to sort of give those cues to folks. So thank you again for trying that on. So my question for you all then here is, let's look at this scenario. Let's say that Alex is new to your agency and on your caseload. I know not all of you are going to be like this. The idea of saying on your caseload might not be as relevant, but roll with me for this one. So Alex is on your caseload and you want to make Alex feel welcome and safe in your care, but you are unsure of Alex's pronouns. How would you initiate a conversation with Alex to make Alex feel welcome and safe and to find out Alex's pronouns? What would you do?
I mean, I guess whenever you introduce yourself, you could just offer your pronouns, maybe, just maybe to get that comfort level going, possibly.
That's great. Thank you, Adam. Yeah, so just like I did at the very beginning, and I've done it a couple of times now. Hey, my name is Ariel. My pronouns are she and hers. I'm going to be working with you today, and I'd love to get to know a little bit more about you, right? And so that might be an invitation for that person to either say, I don't really know what you just said. Can you explain that to me? Or maybe they say, oh, okay. You know, this is my name and these are my pronouns, and nobody's really introduced themselves that way before. Philip also said, and a lot of people here, I see Jacques over here, Heather, multiple people say, yeah, I'm just going to ask. So I'm either going to introduce myself and model that for the client, and or I'm going to ask them, you know, hey, Olivia, it's great to meet you today. I have some questionnaires to go over with you and some things we're going to talk about today. But before we get into that, I'd love to know, are there any particular pronouns you use, or how do you like to be referred to? Do you have any nicknames, anything I should know about you? And again, no matter who the client is, we can be asking this question. And if we ever get pushback, I want to emphasize again, we're not asking about people's you know, bodies or anything like that. What we're saying is, I'm going to have a conversation with you about your life, right? The work that we're doing is pretty intimate in that we are asking a lot of details about people's personal lives and histories. So the least we can do is be able to have a respectful conversation with them where we can build that trust. Jacqueline also said, I honestly don't know. Luckily, any clients that I have been in contact with tell me what they identify with. But Adam offered a good tip for engagement. And that's okay. Again, if you're sitting with this being like, this is still kind of new for me, I'm not so sure how this would look in practice, that's okay. One of the reasons we had you do the breakout rooms, right, is to get a little bit of practice so that if this is brand new for you, or even if it's newer for you, it's not something that, the first time you're doing it is with a client. Instead, it's in this sort of safe container of the training space. So with that in mind, let's look at our takeaways for this unit. Our first takeaway here is that gender expression is not an indicator of sexual orientation. So just because a client walks in and we see them presenting in one particular way, doesn't mean we know anything about who they're attracted to. The next thing is that everybody has a gender identity. All of us in the training have a gender identity, and all of our clients have a gender identity. And then sexual orientation is distinct from sexual behavior. And last but not least, language carries meaning and has an impact, whatever the language is, right? Not just around SOGIE, but all the language we're using in our work has the ability to have an impact. Diana also made a quick note here in the chat, why not avoid gender-specific language? Exactly, so to be more inclusive, right? We can just be using gender-neutral language, asking for people's names, etc. So, and this I should say client here, apologies for that. We don't know if a client is LGBTQ+ unless the client tells us. So with that in mind, I'm gonna pause my slides, and we are actually gonna go into our second and last break of the day. It is 8:50, so let's take a 8:50. Y'all know what I mean. It is 10:50 over there, right? Am I right? Yep. No. Yes. Yes, it is 10:50. Thank you, Kimber, for nodding with me. It is 10:50. Let's take a 10-minute break for you to be able to stretch and again do whatever you need to do. Let's come back at 11 o'clock promptly. All right, welcome back from our second break, folks. I've put up our Kahoot now, so I'm going to ask folks to either in another browser window, or if it's, I recommend if you have just a smartphone to just go to kahoot.it, and it's going to prompt you for that game pin, 7415594. So you're going to go to that website, type in that game pin. It's going to give you a funny little nickname, and then we're going to start our activity. So I'll give you all a minute or two to log on, and hopefully we get as close to all the 40 folks that we have in the training today. And while we do that, there is a short video that I'll put on a little bit about the center.
Social change doesn't happen overnight. It's built upon years of courage, conviction, and sacrifice. Generations of voices unifying to write a revolution. For our 50th anniversary, the Los Angeles LGBT Center celebrates the relentless efforts of the community in the fight for equality by using our own words to create a singular symbol, one that visually defines the future by being assembled letter by letter from the powerful voices of our movement's past. Forward for 50.
So we are about halfway there. I'm going to give folks another 30 seconds or so to join. You'll still be able to join once we get started, but I want to get as many of you into the Kahoot space as possible before we get started. All right, so I'm going to get started. Folks can continue to join as we go along. If you're having any technical difficulties joining, I would ask that you just respond in the comment box. You can do that as well. So we're going to get started, and this is just going to be a fun way to test your knowledge. Just know it's going to be grading you both on getting the right answer, but how quickly you get the right answer. So time is of the essence to make sure you select the right answer as quickly as possible. And obviously it's all in good fun, just a great way again to test your knowledge. So let's get started. And our first question, traditionally, the word cisgender describes a person whose sex assigned at birth and gender identity align. Is that true or false? Red triangle for true, blue diamond for false. And that is true. Awesome. It looks like most of you got that correct. Good job. And starting off on the leaderboard, we got Mystery Giraffe, Golden Leopard, Awesome Kitten, Giving Yeti, and Amazon Gazelle. So our second question here, we're looking for an identity term to describe people who understand their gender to exist outside of the gender binary. Is that red triangle for bisexual, yellow circle for permanency, blue diamond for gay, or green square for non-binary? And we are looking for an non-binary. So good job again, folks, retaining that information. Mystery Giraffe staying in first place. Up 6 places is Noble Emu. And third, this is a culturally specific indigenous term that can mean to possess or fulfill multiple roles across SOGIE. Is that word red triangle for male, yellow circle for two-spirit, blue diamond for pronouns, or green square for gender expression? And that is two-spirit. Again, you might see that abbreviated as 2S sometimes, and that is a culturally specific term. So golden leopard with a answer streak of 3, mystery giraffe holding tight in first place, but we'll see if giving yeti can push you out of your spot. Our fourth question, intersex is a sex assigned at birth term relating to one's physiological traits. Is that red triangle for true or blue diamond for false? And that is true. Again, most of you getting that right. No worries if you were unsure about that. And looks like Mystery Giraffe got it to third place. Amazon Gazelle joining us in first place. Groovy Ant up 3 spots. Describing one's, this word describes one's pattern of attraction over time, emotionally, physically, romantically, etc. Is that red triangle for gender identity, blue diamond for sexual orientation, yellow circle for sexual behavior, or green square for sex assigned at birth? And that is sexual orientation, our pattern of attraction, who we feel those butterflies for. So Mountain Possum jumping up to 5th place. Good job, Mountain Possum. And permanency is a holistic state referring to physical, legal, mental, and emotional safety, stability, and well-being. Is that statement red triangle for true or blue diamond for false? And that statement is true. Again, when we think about permanency, I'm encouraging you all to think about it as expansively as possible. So Fearless Finch, 6 answers in a row. Good job, Fearless Finch. Amazon Gazelle maintaining first place. And our 7th question, we're looking for a self-identification and umbrella term indicating not fitting cultural norms around SOGIE. Is that red triangle for cisgender, yellow circle for heterosexual, blue diamond for gender conforming, or green square for queer? Yeah, and the word we were looking for there is queer. Again, it's one of those in-group versus out-group words. Lots of movement on the leaderboard on that one. Giving Yeti jumping up first place. Epic Eagle also climbing up 3 places. So we're looking for now an adjective to describe a person whose sex assigned at birth and gender identity don't align in the ways most traditionally expect. Is that red triangle for transgender, yellow circle for cisgender, blue diamond for coming out, or green square for lesbian? And the word we were looking for is transgender. Lots of you getting answer streaks. Amazon Gazelle jumping up to first place. And our 9th question here, using somebody's asserted name and pronouns can communicate respect, build rapport, and affirm one's identity. Is that red triangle for true or blue diamond for false? So that, oh, well, we still have some time. That is true. Glad 100%. Everybody got that one. Excellent. And let's go into our last question. If we happen to misgender someone, what should we do? You can select as many as apply. Red triangle, assume somebody's pronouns based on gender expression. Yellow circle, practice for accuracy. Blue diamond, correct and move on. And or green square, apologize. Yeah, so we want to do that set of pieces, right? First, we're going to apologize, we're going to correct ourselves, we're going to move on, and then we're going to practice. So let's see how folks did. In 3rd place, it looks like we had Fearless Finch. Good job, Fearless Finch. In 2nd place, we had Giving Yeti. And in 1st place, see who we had. We had Amazon Gazelle. Then I think we had a couple runners up. We had Mountain something and Mystery something in 4th and 5th place. So good job, everybody. And I'm going to pause that now. Give yourselves a round of applause. You all did very well. And hopefully that was a fun way to engage in the learning process. So we'll do one more of those either at the end of today or certainly tomorrow. But now we're going to jump back into our information here. And if you want to sort of gloat in the chat box, you're welcome to identify who you were, if you were on the leaderboard or anywhere there. So no worries, but good job to everybody. And whoops, let's see. Let me get you to the right slide here. That would be helpful. Alrighty. So in this 3rd unit today, this is going to be our last unit of the day because we have about 45 minutes left. We're going to now sort of move on beyond language and terminology and start to think about our practice, right? How are we showing up for clients and how are we thinking about, again, the different ways that they may be experiencing our services so that we can better support them. So we're going to do that. And then, as I mentioned, we'll be finishing up in about 45 minutes. So no more breaks today, but we will have plenty of time to dig in tomorrow. And again, if you have questions as we go along, please feel free to go ahead and put those in the chat. So I want to introduce you to a couple of additional terms that we're going to look at here. The first term we have here is anti-gay bias. The second one is anti-transgender bias, and the third one is heterosexism. But before we do that, we have to sort of look at this idea of bias as it is. And this might be a conversation that a lot of you are having at your agencies right now as it is, these conversations around implicit bias, right? The different ways in which we have taken in different information over our lives. We have maybe gotten misinformation, right? And so we develop biases against different people, different groups that have the ability to impact us not only in our personal lives, but certainly within our professional practice. So when we're looking at anti-gay bias, right, we're looking at hatred, aversion, or discrimination towards folks who are lesbian, gay, or bisexual, people who are perceived to be, and those who are associated with LGBT people. So there's a lot of different ways that this may show up. For example, we may see a client being told that they aren't eligible for services at our agency because of how they identify. Now, we'll get into the legality of that a little bit tomorrow, but that's something that unfortunately many clients still experience. Maybe they are told, well, we can't serve you as a gay man in our program. We don't have the resources to serve you. And that may be coming from a place of, I don't know that our agency has the knowledge. It may also be coming from a place of, we don't want you here, right? But it can be a lot of different sort of energy behind that. So there's lots of different ways anti-gay bias can show up. We might also see anti-transgender bias, so hatred, discrimination, or aversion, in this case to transgender people, folks who are gender variant, or people who are perceived to be transgender or associated with transgender people. And this one is especially pervasive. We see it showing up a lot of times when it comes to assigning beds, figuring out which housing programs they're eligible for, right? And so we may say, well, you have to go with the housing program that aligns with the sex you were assigned at birth. So if you were assigned female at birth, you have to go to a women's shelter. If you were assigned male at birth, you have to go to a men's shelter, right? So we might see that happening. We might also see folks saying, again, we can't serve you at all, right? You're a safety risk to our other clients, is unfortunately a common thing that we hear being told to transgender clients. And then the last piece that we look at is heterosexism. And this is sort of the societal belief or system of beliefs that everybody is heterosexual or should be heterosexual, and that anything that sort of deviates from that is wrong. And sometimes, again, this shows up in very explicit ways that we might expect, right? In all of these things, we can maybe imagine the harmful words and ways that people may talk about folks that fit within these. But again, there might, again, be just sort of inherent ways that we don't make space for LGBTQ plus people. So I gave that example earlier. Maybe we are working with a veteran and we're talking about benefits and looking at the fact that maybe they lost benefits because of don't ask, don't tell. And they haven't been able to tap into certain benefits that they're entitled to that could absolutely help stabilize their housing, right? So that is a form of heterosexism, but isn't necessarily at the forefront of somebody saying actively right now in this moment that I don't support you or your needs. And these things can take place on different levels, right? They can take place on an individual basis, meaning you and I, all of us here in the space are coworkers manifesting these things, but also at an institutional level, whether that be at your agency, in the continuum of care in your region, or broader policies. So we're going to watch this video from the Movement Advancement Project and SAGE, and it's called Aging as LGBT: Two Stories. So after we watch this video, we'll have a chance to debrief and unpack some of the different biases and experiences that the folks featured in this video experience. So pay attention to what those biases are, but again, always be thinking about, well, what are the opportunities there? If I was working with this person, what might I be doing differently?
As the American public ages, so do lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people. LGBT older adults face the same challenges as other older adults, including financial worries and health concerns. But LGBT older adults face additional challenges. Let's compare two women, Tina and Jackie, who were both born in 1947. In 1967 at college, Tina meets Frank and Jackie meets Francis. On a date with Francis after work, Jackie is seen by a coworker who tells their boss. Jackie is legally fired and takes a lesser-paying job at a factory. In 1973, Tina marries Frank, but Jackie is unable to marry Francis. In the 80s, Tina and Frank have children, but Jackie and Francis are barred from adopting. After decades of hard work, in 2010, Frank and Francis retire. Tina takes Social Security spousal benefits. But because the federal government didn't recognize same-sex marriages then, Jackie is denied those benefits. In 2015, right before the freedom to marry becomes available nationwide, Frank and Francis die. Tina pays for her in-home care with her Social Security survivor benefits and funds from Frank's pension. Jackie is denied Social Security survivor benefits, and because she was not a legal spouse, is also denied Francis's pension. Their apartment was rented in Francis's name, and her state lacks non-discrimination protections in housing, so Jackie is evicted when she tries to change the lease into her name. Lacking an income and a place to live, Jackie moves into a nursing home and relies on Medicaid to pay for it. She fears discrimination if she shares stories about her past, so she doesn't talk about her life with Francis. Tina can afford in-home nursing care and has the support of her children. After a lifetime of discrimination, LGBT older adults face economic insecurity, poorer health, and reduced support networks.
All right, so let's take a chance to reflect on these two sort of stories. The first question I have for you all in the chat box is, what was the kind of bias that Jackie experienced? Was it anti-gay bias, anti-transgender bias, and or heterosexism? Angela says all three. Okay. Any other thoughts on that one? Alice says anti-gay and heterosexism. Chelsea as well. Any other guesses? Yeah. So I would say primarily anti-gay and anti-gay bias and heterosexism. And what are some examples of anti-gay bias that Jackie experienced? Where do we see that specifically anti-gay bias showing up in her care or in her experience? So first and foremost, yeah, Chelsea says Jackie was fired from her job when she was outed. Adam said, yeah, so Jackie wasn't able to marry or adopt at the time. Alice also said, yeah, so in a nursing home, she wasn't able to be out, to talk about who she was, to be able to receive culturally responsive care. Angela pointing out as well, health benefits were impacted. And Eric, yeah, she was unable to collect survivor benefits. So do we think Jackie could experience anti-transgender bias? And if so, why or why not? What are our thoughts about that? Angela says no. Any other thoughts? So great clarifying question, because the question was like, if Jackie's not transgender, would she be experiencing anti-transgender bias? And again, this is sort of one of those trick questions. The answer is possibly. Without knowing more about this particular person, we don't know. But anti-transgender bias can affect folks who are transgender, but again, it can also affect folks who are perceived to be or associated with. And a lot of the ways that we see anti-transgender bias showing up is the ways in which we police gender. So if Jackie maybe was more masculine than feminine, Jackie could have also experienced anti-transgender bias because she deviated from, again, sort of the societal norms or expectations of how a woman should behave or and sort of show up. So it's possible. We definitely need more information, as Diana and a couple of folks pointed out. And then how would we say bias impacted Jackie's long-term permanency? What was the impact that these different forms of bias that Jackie experienced had on all the different elements of her own permanency story? So Alice says ongoing from very beginning of losing job to not being able to marry and collect benefits. Yeah, so that affected employment, which also affected income, which also affected longer term benefits to be able to age, well and be able to survive. What else? Samantha also said there were a lot of barriers in place. The bias impacted her entire life, Kimberly says. Any other additional examples or ways that you see bias impacting Jackie's life? Not being able to have children. yeah, so if that was something that was important to Jackie and her partner, that was something that, you know, at the time she wasn't able to do. And when we think about this, I guess the big piece I'm getting to, right, particularly for folks who are working with older populations, do we see any relationship here to Jackie's potential to showing up in the homeless services system? Yeah, so Gwen's saying, yep, yep. Lauren, financial stability, absolutely. And it's something that I think, right, we often don't talk about. It's something that also, when we talk about, as I mentioned earlier, right, the research and statistics, there's a lot of research and statistics around LGBTQ plus young people experiencing homelessness. When you start to get into older populations in general, the research is fewer and far between, especially region specific. But we do know that LGBTQ plus people overall tend to experience more economic instability because of all of these different types of things that were described in this particular video. So with that in mind, we want to also talk about then the coming out process, right? What are the challenges? What are the benefits? Because we oftentimes think about this as something that may be a negative experience for folks, but that's not always the case. And for many folks, it can be liberating and it can create opportunities to be able to access services that are important to them. As we saw in Jackie's case, right? Jackie wasn't able to really be out and open and supported in her identity, and that had a lifelong impact on her. So there's a lot of challenges that we know about when it comes to coming out. And when we're referring to coming out, we're talking about sharing your sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression with somebody else by choice. That is different than being outed, meaning somebody shares that information without your consent. And we have to understand that when we out somebody, when we share that information, we have the ability to do harm if we are doing so without that person's consent. That could absolutely result in a lot of different things, everything from violence to harassment, exiting from programs, right? So we really want to be mindful of that. And some of the things that we see as far as challenges, right? Fear of losing loved ones. We saw that in George's story and we saw that in Jackie's story. Fear of rejection, of judgment, again, be that from your family and friends or from, you know, society, from providers, doctors, you name it. Fear of losing vital resources. Again, we see that particular story really encapsulating all the ways in which benefits were cut off, access to a lot of different things were cut off. And fear of violence, fear of bullying. When we think about coming out, we know that LGBTQ plus folks, especially transgender folks, are actually at a much higher risk of experiencing violence and harm in housing programs, as opposed to sort of the opposite. So this sort of narrative in particular that transgender folks are a risk to other clients is statistically and anecdotally untrue. And then folks can also internalize bias, right? So, you know, thinking about those different biases that we just talked about, we know that folks can start to believe those different messages, right? They can start to believe, you know, maybe I am bad. Maybe there is something wrong with me. Maybe I'm not deserving of this. And that may show up in the ambivalence that we see in clients. The client who's like, well, why do I need to come to that appointment? Why do I need to have a good attitude? Why do I need to do these things? Who may really believe like that they don't deserve those things, that those things aren't something that they can access. On the other hand, coming out is not all doom and gloom. We know that there's a number of benefits to coming out. The first one is empowerment, right? Is being able to share who you are and do well. Increasing your self-esteem. So again, knowing that you are worthy of things. Creating wholeness, so not having to segment yourself in different spaces, and strengthen the relationships, be that again with family, with friends, with your formal supports like you all, to be able to say, yeah, I can trust you. I can trust this program, this agency to help me get my needs met. And then reducing the stress of hiding. And in addition to just knowing that when we're able to be our whole self, and again, not have to kind of compartmentalize and worry, well, gosh, if I accidentally slip up when I'm talking to my housing navigator, is that going to affect, my eligibility? That alone, right, is great to not be stressed out about that. But the other thing that we know is that chronic stress is really bad for our health, no matter who we are. And most of our clients, in fact, I would argue all of our clients, because the very nature of experiencing homelessness, are experiencing some form of trauma and are experiencing stress. So the less stress that somebody can experience, and certainly over a less amount of time, the better they're going to be doing overall. Their health, their well-being, all of that is going to be more positive. So when we think about that, then we can also think about how do we support a client like George, like Jackie, when they do come out to us. And we can look at things like words and phrases that maybe aren't going to be the most helpful if a client decides to disclose this information to us. If they're a young person, we don't want to say things like, well, I think you're too young to make that kind of decision. That is really dismissive of their experience. And if they are able to verbalize and tell us this information, they're not too young, right? Sexual orientation develops around 6 to 12 years old, gender identity 2.5 to 6 years old. So that's just invalidating. And it really isn't our place to say you're either too young, too old, whatever, to identify this way. Why are you that way? So kind of, again, doubting like, what made you this way? What happened to you? We also don't want to say things like, I knew it, or I could tell, right? Because that could also cause a state of panic. Like, what do you mean you knew it? Do other people know this? Am I unsafe? Or on the other hand, if you knew this whole time, why didn't you engage me in a conversation about this? Because I was really stressed about telling you this. Saying things like, you don't look gay. What does a gay person look like? That's perpetuating stereotypes. And then I don't judge or I don't care. These are phrases that I think culturally we often say when we do mean I do care. So what we can say instead, right, is oftentimes we say like, I don't care, but we mean this doesn't change the way I view you, or this doesn't change how I want to support you. And that's something we could say instead. And I don't judge implies that there is something to judge. So I don't judge, but other people may judge, but I don't judge, right? So it's kind of like when people say no offense, you feel, like, I know something offensive is about to come out of your mouth, right? Like that's one of those phrases where you're like, I don't judge, not me. My coworker in the next cubicle might, but not me. So those just aren't helpful phrases. Instead, we can think about using coming out as an opportunity to support the client. So if they choose to come out to you, thank you for trusting me with this information. Let me know how I can support you. Is this information that you want to keep between us? Is there an expectation of confidentiality that you have? And again, we'll talk about this tomorrow, but is that something that I can maintain? How do you want me to refer to you in front of others? So maybe they let you know, hey, I'm transitioning. I'm going to be going by this name and these pronouns, but I'm not out to everybody right now. So for the time being, I would prefer that just with you and I, we use that name, but in front of other folks, maybe in the group room, we don't use that. We use the name on my legal documents. We can also use it as an opportunity to learn more about what their experience has been and where they need support. The other piece then when somebody comes out is we want to be able to assess for safety and well-being. So making sure that wherever they're currently living or staying and where we're kind of putting them into, what that path looks like for their case, that their safety and well-being around their SOGIE is considered. Because again, we want them to be successful. So we want to understand what they're experiencing in their coming out process, where they need support, and do they feel safe? And lastly, if there's any particular challenges that they're having. The other piece too is then we also want to make sure that when we are doing an assessment, so maybe we're looking at a new program that we're going to refer them to. Maybe it's a treatment facility. Maybe it's an employment program. Maybe it's a gang intervention program, you name it. We want to make sure that we have permission from the client to disclose that type of information. And if we don't, we might just call up the agency and sort of do that vetting ourselves without outing the client. And then when issues do come up, whether it's a disciplinary issue, right, a boundary issue, issue with the client maybe not meeting sort of their case management goals, we want to be able to identify the core issue and understand, is this something that is or could be related to their SOGIE? Is there a reason why maybe whatever that particular program is wasn't an appropriate fit for them because of their SOGIE? And we also want to be able to assess and understand, are there affirming behaviors that they're experiencing in this program around their SOGIE, if that's relevant? And or are there any particularly rejecting behaviors, right? Are there reasons why they might be experiencing bias, harassment, discrimination, anything else that, again, might impact their success in the program? So I'm going to put you in our last breakout rooms of the day. And you're going to be in groups of about 5 or 6 folks this time around. And in your groups, you're going to answer one of these questions. The first question that I'm going to give to groups 1 and 2 are, how might biases cause entry into systems of care? The second question, which is going to be for groups 3 and 4, how might clients encounter biases once they are in the system? So once they have formally entered homeless services, what are some of those biases they might experience? And then my last 2 groups, group 5 and 6, you're going to be answering this last question. How might biases challenge permanency options? So let me tell you who those groups are, just so you know when we get into there. Groups 1 and 2 are Angela, Ashley, Beth, Holly, Keisha, Lauren, Stacy, Adam, Allison, Jan, Jacques, Kimberly, and Tia. You're answering question number 1. Groups 3 and 4, Amanda, Heather, Jacqueline, Samantha, Teresa, Tim, Angela, Chelsea, Diana, Eric, James, and Jessica. That's question number 2. And my last 2 groups, group 5 and 6, are answering that last question. That's Alice, Christina, Katie, Kim, Kimberly, Rebecca, Allison, April, Gwen, Michelle, Olivia, and Philip. So you'll have about 5 minutes to answer this question. And please make sure that somebody is kind of taking notes and prepared to report out to the larger group.